we come into optimum cooling, we can resume with launching. Roger. Resume attacks immediately.
Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for Minamoto no Tametomo. He's a 5-star general pool archer added to the game with the 8 Dog Chronicles event, though he makes his first appearance in Trom. I wonder how Kagekiyo feels about our newest Genji being a robot. I guess you wouldn't make it past the Genji part before running off to pick a fight, but this guy's got the mechanical trait and everything. Not that it matters unless you're in the habit of fighting mysterious idols. A cool novelty, but let's see if his actual skill set is a bit more substantive. Leading things off is Shinsei Hachiro. This is a 3-time buster and 3-turn crit damage buff. I generally dislike hit-based steroids, but as far as you'd combo this with your Noble Phantasm, you can get by on using 1 stack a turn to complete your run. But in more complex fights, this limitation can be irritating. On the bright side though, Shinsei Hachiro has a short 5-turn cooldown that potentially allows it to be double stacked with a bit of help. Next we've got Indomitable Bowmanship. This is a Guts that, when popped, increases Tametomo's NP damage and cleanses. It's also an upfront 30% battery, so you should level it first. Unlike a lot of other double-sided skills, the defensive half being a Guts makes it convenient to fire and forget. The last of Tametomo's regular skills is Mechanical Archery. This is a package of 5-turn buffs, sure hit, and a recurring effect that increases NP damage 1 time per stack and feeds him 10% charge per turn. Unfortunately, the cooldown is too long to double stack this without compromising your other priorities. The lengthy nature of this skill seems to incline Tametomo towards long, grinding fights, but the current buster support structure isn't geared towards this style of play. We'll talk a little more about that later, though there are ways of leaning into this. Minamoto no Tametomo's Noble Phantasm is Gochin Yumi Harusuki. It's an AoE buster attack with preemptive invuln pierce and defense ignore. This effect persists for the turn, letting you follow up with his face cards. It also preemptively buffs his buster performance, but only on waterside terrain, making that part unreliable. It overcharges anti-lawful damage, which is quite nice. Apparently the lawful alignment is very common amongst sabers, so you could potentially get some nice mileage here. First of all, Tametomo can loop. The optimal setup for him is to get his charge append and equip him with a 50% charge craft essence. The first day of filming is orthodox for this purpose, but you can actually run Golden Sumo instead, since no servant in this team actually has an attack buff. The idea is that you pop all the skills plus any relevant Koenskaya buffs right away for an NP, then you have both of your Koenskayas charge him up for turn 2. On turn 3 you swap in Oberon and use his full buff package, along with any of Tametomo's skills that have come off cooldown. It gets the job done, and against the lawful final boss, you could do some serious damage. Taking a step back, this all seems pretty solid, and in a vacuum, it is. Looking at that anti-lawful buff again, I did some quick numbers on the Saber class. Of the 52 playable Sabers, including ones released on JP, 26 of them are a lawful alignment. Tametomo gets bonus damage against half of all Sabers currently in existence. Pretty good, right? But what if I told you there's another Buster Archer with 96% coverage? That's right, it's our old pal Gilgamesh. Of all the Saber servants in the game, only 2 don't take bonus damage from Enema Elish, Void Shiki and Charlemagne. If you're fighting someone else, Tametomo is going to lose the head-to-head barring some pretty outlandish scenarios involving his situational buffs. Now Tametomo has one very nice trick up his sleeve that Gilgamesh doesn't. His third append skill is the ever-coveted anti-berserker damage. This combined with his buster playstyle means that Tametomo is quite adept at decimating our resonant glass cannons, especially if you're fighting bulked up mid-boss enemies and other non-servants. Against proper enemies though, we see Gilgamesh's privilege shine through again. Almost every Berserker is weak to Enema Elish with 3 exceptions: MHX Alter, Summer Castoria, and Shizuki Sojuro. None of those are lawful for the record. So what's all this mean? First of all, this isn't exactly a fair comparison. Gilgamesh is a limited servant, and Tametomo is general pool, which is a distinction with some significance. But before we get too deep into that, you've got to understand that Tametomo is placed in a very crowded role. High-rarity AoE Buster Archers are something the game has repeatedly experimented with, and in terms of generalist usage, Tametomo's newcomer status is actually a disadvantage considering his rivals have NP upgrades. 2 of them, Gilgamesh and Ishtar, are fan favorites and potential targets for future buffs regardless of whether they deserve them or not, though Ishtar could probably use some sort of anti-buff to keep up with the competition. The point is I wouldn't consider Tametomo a proper headhunt target, given the alternatives. The way I see it, he's more of a go-with-the-flow kind of archer. As a general pool servant, he can appear unexpectedly, and while you shouldn't count on it happening, this does mean that relatively new players can utilize his strengths, and he's got plenty of them. On top of his anti-lawful effect, Tametomo has the Ibuki combo of Defense Ignore and Invuln Pierce, letting him snipe out fortified enemies. Effects like this aren't as rare in the Archer class as they are for Sabers, but it's still nice to have. With the Guts, it's a nice package that lets you adapt to the wide variety of situations you'll encounter in the early to mid-game. And despite being introduced in Trom, Tametomo only uses Trom materials in his append skills. Yeah, you could use pure prisms even if this wasn't the case, but blowing your entire supply on ashes or daggers doesn't seem like the greatest idea right off the bat. This feeds into my theory that Tametomo was designed to be a mid-game servant. If you stick to boss fights, you can utilize a more slow-moving buster team to grind out your enemy. Merlin is quite nice for this style of play, and he'll feed you charge and healing over time while also enabling big burst turns. For your third member, two options really stand out to me. The first is Himiko, who has a buster, crit, and overcharge package, with that last part enhancing Tametomo's anti-lawful effect. Then again, if you got a Merlin and Himiko, you could just replace Tametomo with Castoria to form the Immortal team. But unless you're in a particularly long and punishing fight, that shouldn't be necessary for mid-game scuffles. Option number 2, ironically, is Constantine the 11th. Not current NA Constantine. You run him in your team and you're setting yourself up for an ass beating. On JP though, he recently got a buff to his Noble Phantasm. Very recently. Like within 2 weeks of me calling him the worst 5-star in the game. Thanks, Lozangle. Evidently, if I shit talk a servant enough, they'll get buffed. Maybe it's time for me to remake the Shuten guide. Constantine's Buster buff now affects the entire team, and you get a party NP damage effect to go along with it. Then and his invuln now stacks on top of other invulnerability effects and lasts for 3 turns if it somehow doesn't get popped before then. While Constantine's regular skill set is still unbuffed and dysfunctional, he can actually work in a real team now, especially with Merlin who covers for many of his deficiencies. As long as you can keep both Constantine and Tametomo fed with charge, you'll have both an unbreakable defense and an unstoppable offense. Not too shabby, huh? I think I can safely say that Tametomo is a decent servant, but not a priority pick by any means. He's got an anti-buff, which is potentially useful in any ++ nodes, his utility package has applications in boss fights, and he has the 3rd highest attack stat in the Archer class. But none of this makes him exceptional within the Archer class. Not even that attack stat. He's winning that race by inches. A lot of his competitors are also in the 12k range, and despite this stat, Tametomo has the lowest NP damage of the 5-star Buster Archers unless you get his special conditions going. The main advantage is that he can come to you, in contrast to many of his betters. He's a good servant for new players, and him being in the general pool suggests that you're meant to ride off his momentum if you get him early on into account building. To be fair, I don't think that's a bad idea, so when it comes to Tametomo, don't roll for him. Roll with him. Hey, guess what? History's back, baby! I'd like to go back and deal with the other Trom servants, but since I have a moment to catch my breath, let's start things off with Tametomo while we have him here. Tametomo lived in the final decades of the Heian period. Imperial power was a huge mess around this time. Emperors had their powers limited by the Fujiwara clan, who acted as regents and dominated the imperial family through marriages and money. But the emperors developed an unusual way of fighting back. They'd retire. By designating a successor and then retiring to a monastery, the emperors could frustrate attempts to instate a puppet by enthroning a puppet themselves. Taking up vows wouldn't stop them from meddling in temporal affairs either. These cloistered emperors had quite a bit more power than reigning emperors and would force the latter to abdicate at will. But wait, you might be thinking, don't they then become cloistered emperors themselves? Not quite. The first one in the hot seat got to call all the shots, and everyone else just had to wait in line. As it turns out, the resulting logjams of authority were a breeding ground for trouble. When one particular emperor died, competing candidates emerged to control the nature of his replacement. One was a retired emperor, Sutoku. The other was a reigning emperor, Go Shirakawa. Both were under the thumb of an older, cloistered emperor, but the second he died, they were off to the races. You're going to see the Minamoto and Taira clans come up a lot during this story, and while they did fight each other, this wasn't strictly a Minamoto versus Taira war. That would come down the road. The clans were divided on who to back, and so you had members of the same clan lining up against each other. Even the Fujiwara split their support. This particular event is called the Hogan Rebellion, no relation to the assassin. Minamoto no Tametomo was, along with his father, on the side of the retired emperor, Sutoku. The two factions were holed up in palaces in Kyoto, but Tametomo suggested striking first in an ambitious night attack, anticipating that his treacherous brother would attempt to do something similar. However, this plan was vetoed by one of the Fujiwara big shots, who wanted something a little more conventional, cinematic even. Well, guess what? The Go Shirakawa faction struck first. They surrounded the palace in question, and this turned into a standoff, with archers going to town on each other. This played into Tametomo's strengths. You see, he was a bit of a genetic freak, and not normal. His left arm was a few inches longer than his right arm, and this let him get an exceptionally long draw on his bow. That added power gave his shots a devastating punch, something that the Go Shirakawa forces found out the hard way. The showdown pretty much started with him blowing away one of the commanders, and things didn't go much better for anyone who tried to get a beat on him. Then someone had a thought. Hey, instead of letting this human artillery piece turn our heads into pincushions, why don't we just set the goddamn place alight? If nothing else, the smoke would nullify Tametomo's superior range. The trick worked, and the Sudoku forces were routed. A bunch of their central figures died in the fire. Others were captured. The cloistered emperor was sent into exile, and so was Tametomo, though the Go Shirakawa-aligned part of the Taira clan had a little business with him first. Having experienced his fearsome archery, they fucked up his long arm, supposedly severing a tendon in the process. Then they left him to rot on a small island. But they weren't done with him yet. They needed him out of sight and out of mind for a little while before they came back to finish him off. The rivalry between the Minamoto and Taira clans was intensifying, and they didn't want this larger-than-life figure coming back to haunt them, so they dispatched the force to his island. Before I continue, let me say that Tametomo is a figure that's more legend than history to begin with, like there was a Minamoto no Tametomo, but beyond that, some of the stuff he does is pretty fanciful. Tametomo was tipped off, so he was waiting for the Taira, who were approaching on ships. It's hard to get good equipment on his crappy little island, but he did have a bow and some arrows. That arm the Taira cut up? It healed, and these would-be assassins found it out firsthand when they started getting pinned to their boats. While he was avenging himself upon the Taira forces, he did something incredible. He fired an arrow with such violence that it penetrated the hull of one ship and came out the other side, below the waterline. While the Taira clan dealt with the chaos caused by the sinking ship, Tametomo retreated to his hut, and, understanding that it was only a matter of time before he ran out of ammunition, decided to deny the Taira clan the satisfaction of killing him. He committed seppuku, and expired long before the assassins made landfall. If this is true, that would make him one of the, if not the earliest recorded instance of the practice. The Taira clan would ride high for a little longer, but in just 10 years, they'd be embroiled in a fight for their lives against the resurgent Minamoto. This is a war they'd lose, leading to the collapse of the Taira and the definitive end of the Heian period, paving the way for the first shogunate. But those events would take us into the stories of figures like Ushiwaka Maru and Tomoe Gozen, so we can save that for another day. Thanks for watching, lads. Like if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, and come watch me at twitch.tv/Finotaisen, where I stream every week, 3 p.m. Pacific time, Friday through Sunday. This time I've got Metroid Fusion on Friday, Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel on Saturday, and FGO on Sunday, so stop on by and say hi. See you there.